Nick, welcome. So yeah, you downgraded it when it was at 240. Now it's at 165. Good job. Are we getting into value territory anytime soon? And say more about this argument that I guess that Spotify is not the Netflix of music in the sense that it can't raise prices without consequence, and Pandora is actually doing a bit better on the digital radio side?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me on. I think certainly it's not Netflix. In some ways, it's a better business model because they don't have to buy any content. They don't have to invest in episodes of The Crown at $10 million a pop. All the content is put onto their platform by musicians and by labels, and Spotify doesn't need to make any investments. The flip side of that is they have to pay roughly nearly 70% of their revenues to those creators. And that doesn't leave them with a lot of margin to play with. So out of that 30%, they have to pay for all the selling and marketing, which, funny enough, adds up to about 30%. So the company makes no money structurally. And in order to make some money, they've tried to pivot into podcasts, which is obviously creating some other issues for them, as you just heard from the clip with Daniel Ek talking about Joe Rogan. So really, it's definitely not a Netflix. It's a very, very different business model. It's a platform. And structurally, it needs to find a way to make a margin. Now, the big disappointment last night was really the margin. There was some disappointment on subscribers as well, but they guided to a 25% margin in Q1. That's the same margin they've been making in Q1 for the last 3 years. So there's been no expansion in that first quarter margin, and people are worried that this year the margin may not even go up at all in the full year.
Nick, I wonder if the company had to choose, would they want to be in the music streaming business or in the podcast business? Because it seems like in the podcast business, there aren't a million Taylor Swifts and Aerosmiths and Bruce Springsteens, and you end up getting beholden to someone like a Joe Rogan, just separate from all of the information controversy.
That's a great question. I mean, the reason why they went into podcasts is because they can control the margin if they own the content. But it's very hard to own the content. They had to go out and license Joe Rogan. And of course, the second problem that you have when you try and own the content in podcasts is that you might find the content's controversial, and music is very rarely controversial. So on the one hand, you don't like the music business too much because you have to pay out nearly 70% to the labels. And on the other, you've got the podcast business, which comes with all the problems of being a platform and distributing information. And we see those problems with Facebook and YouTube and Twitter all the time. You know, who do you allow on and who do you take off? We all agree some people have to be taken off. You know, you don't want racist behavior or anything like that. But where do you draw the line? And that becomes a very big problem.
Yeah, and Nick, that whole idea of Spotify owning the content, making it more of a publisher than a platform, is that more relevant for a Spotify, which is spending so much on podcasters versus, say, a Facebook that isn't spending as much on its creators? So could this potentially be a bigger problem for Spotify than some of the other platforms?
We actually think they should stop trying to own any content, actually. I mean, it was a good idea to do it to try and kickstart the podcast strategy. But the problem is they have very little content, actually. Despite all the noise about Joe Rogan, we think they've got well under 10% of the podcast listening on their platform is to their own podcast. The rest is information that is just uploaded by other people, whether it's the New York Times, BBC, other podcasts that Spotify does not own. So we don't think they can get into building more and more content and having, 30, 40% of podcast listening owned by them. Instead, what they need to do, and they are doing, is try to get into ad tech, inserting adverts for third-party podcasters and getting a 30% margin on that each time they do it. But it's a slow process. And one of the things we've said over the last 9 months or so while we've been sellers is the podcast business is not as big as people think it is. So it's a good business, potentially, but it's not as big as people think.